Is Paul's mentioning of men and women in Romans 1:26 and 27 actually a specific reference to the flood and Sodom stories and not homosexuality? Hi, my name is Dr. Jordan Koss, and this is the Millennial Harbinger channel. We're going to be talking about that question and a specific article that presents that argument, saying Paul's not talking about homosexuality here. He's actually referring to the Flood and Sodom stories in Romans 1. So, Romans 1, according to the argument of Brett Provance, a professor at Cal Baptist University, Paul isn't saying anything about homosexuality here. He's rather referring to the Flood and Sodom stories of Genesis 6 and 19, just like many other Jewish authors before him. So the article is titled "The Romans 1:26 to 27 in its Rhetorical Tradition." Again, the author is Brett Provance. I found this article for free online, academia.edu, which is great. I wish more authors and scholars would put their stuff online for free. But if you've got a seminary library access, obviously you can get a hold of that very easily as well. But what I'm going to do here, I'm going to split this article up into two videos. And I'm going to talk about kind of the first half ish. The first half is all about him saying, hey, what he calls the status quo interpretation is wrong. The interpretation that Paul is specifically referring to male and female same-sex sex, and arguing why it's wrong. That's his first section. Majority of the article is him arguing his case on why Paul isn't referring to same-sex sex, male and female. So two videos. I want to start by reading the introduction and conclusion, as I usually do, to kind of get like a frame of like, okay, what's this author trying to do here? And then go from there. We'll read the first section where he's trying to argue, again, against what he calls the traditional, not so much traditional, but the modern interpretation. Interesting terminology use there, modern interpretation. Okay, here we go. Intro. He says, this essay offers an interpretive perspective on Romans 1:26 to 27 that differs from the common view that the passage is an indictment of both female and male same-sex sexual activity and suggests a rhetorical tradition for the passage that is overlooked, namely, reference to the stories found in Genesis 6 and 19, which are often linked in wisdom and apocalyptic context in the New Testament and other ancient literature. Very long opening sentence right there, but here the terminology again is interesting. He says, he calls it's the common view, which is the view that says Paul is talking about male and female same-sex sex. And then he calls what he's going to argue something that is overlooked. All right. But the last couple sentences of this opening paragraph go like this. With this alternative perspective, the paper finds that homosexuality is not the main concern in this passage, and female same-sex sexual activity is not to be found in the passage at all. Rather, the two verses fit naturally in a traditional judgment proclamation. A traditional judgment proclamation. Okay, and so let's kind of like try to summarize based upon the terminology that he uses here, the two sides he's arguing. Okay, so here we go. My summation, based upon his intro, for his position is he calls it an alternative perspective. Again, that's overlooked, all right? And that is that homosexuality is not the main concern in Romans 1, and that female same-sex sexual activity is not to be found in the passage at all, all right? And his reasoning is actually Genesis 6 and 19, saying Paul's talking about that, not about same-sex sex. So he is arguing in this article for an affirming position. This is a academic journal article in the affirming stream, if you will. This, what I'll call a modern affirming stream. Okay. The other view he calls common. He calls it, in the first sentence of the next paragraph we haven't read yet, the prevalent modern interpretation. Okay. He calls it the status quo interpretation. That's the heading for his first main section where he's going to say why that's wrong. And just interesting terminology to use. And he defines this perspective in the opening paragraph as an indictment of male and female same-sex sexual activity. And this obviously, of course, is the non-affirming position, right? And so here's my initial thought before reading the conclusion and starting into the first section. My initial thought is like, why can't you have both? Why can't you have both? Why can't you have Paul intentionally and specifically referring to the Flood and Sodom stories, as well as Paul making what we would refer to as a non-affirming argument? Can you not have Paul specifically referencing the Flood and Sodom stories, as well as talking about how lesbian and gay same-sex sex is actually also a sin as well? Can't you have both? That's my question, and I think that's my argument. Is like, I think you can, but let's read the conclusion. Let's read the conclusion. And here's what he says. This paper seeks to offer a better general explanation of Romans 1:26 through 27 than the status quo, right? This paper has put forth evidence that Romans 1:26 through 27 is to be understood as participating in the rhetorical tradition of citing the two great divine judgments in Genesis as part of an indictment of or warning to humanity. The tradition, a dual event rhetorical topos, that couples the antediluvian world chaos involving women, angels, and giants with the story of the city of Sodom and its destruction. It was a popular motif that appears in a number of ancient works. And can I just say, I love the fact that he's referring to these two stories and making this argument, because I think that that's, again, in the pew, this the understanding of the Genesis 6 story, the Watchers, the women, the giants, it's starting to become a little bit more popular, right, through the prevalence of the discussion on podcasts, etc. But not that prevalent, because you can still get in trouble if you bring it up, I think, in churches and Christian schools. I know I have, right? But I like the fact that he is bringing this up and making that argument. But let me put a pin in that real quick, and let me finish this concluding paragraph. The Sodom tradition easily corresponds to the particulars of verse 27, Philo's account, quite similar in certain language. The legend of the sexual interaction of women with angels in the antediluvian world fits the language of verse 26. So Paul's order of the women's indiscretions mentioned first in Romans 1:26 and 27 parallels the biblical and chronological presentation of the stories in Genesis, and Paul's use of the language and rhetoric of 1 Enoch 15-16 solidifies the connection. Perhaps one of the earliest, if not earliest, witnesses to the Greek translation of 1 Enoch. Similar language is shared by Romans 1:18-32 with various manifestations of the dual event rhetorical topos, with homoios, which is translated, I think, likewise, with homoios at times the link for the two great judgments. On a final note, one ought to consider the one named Thelus, Thaliah in the biblical literature, namely Judith. And he ends quoting a passage from the book of Judith. But the Lord Almighty has foiled them by the hand of a woman, for their mighty one did not fall by the hands of the young men, nor did the sons of the Titans strike him down, nor did tall giants set upon him. But Judith, daughter of Merari, with the beauty of her countenance, undid him. Her sandal ravished his eyes, her beauty captivated his mind, and the sword severed his neck. And there he highlights terminology found in the book of Judith that I think he's also arguing is found in similar passages related to Romans 1 as well. But how Judith there uses her feminine wiles as mentioned in First Enoch, that they were taught those things to defeat the dude in this story. So yeah, okay, that's his conclusion. But yeah, I think I love it. I like how he is arguing that Genesis 6 and 19 are specifically referenced in Romans 1. And I think he's right. I think the foundation upon which Paul is making his argument are those stories, is the prologue in Genesis 1 through 11, as well as Sodom. Whenever you talk about, I guess, sexual deviancy or same-sex sex or sexual sin, that those particular stories always are the foundation upon which every story that comes after it is built upon. It's why we have perhaps you could argue the Torah laws that talk about same-sex sex as sinful against Torah in the first place, as others have argued how Sodom is a story, is Torah told in narrative form, and that it helps us understand the Torah laws that are found later, and the Torah laws found later help us understand the Sodom story. But yeah, I think that when viewing Romans 1, as Dr. Michael Heiser briefly mentioned in his work, The Unseen Realm, says this isn't the number one place to go to see the Deuteronomy 32 worldview at play. And if the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, which takes into consideration the enchanted understanding and reading of Genesis 6 as the watchers and the women and the giants, and that's the reason why God sent the flood to stop them, as well as like a supernatural understanding of Sodom, and those two stories also very parallel to each other. If that forms the foundation for Romans 1, yeah, Paul definitely does have the Flood and Sodom stories in mind, but that also then leads us toward a non-affirming understanding of Romans 1 instead of an affirming take on Romans 1. Okay, so that's my argument in a gist before launching into his first section here. So let's start reading his first section, which is titled The Status Quo Interpretation, a Reassessment. Okay? The prevalent modern interpretation of these two verses is that they involve female and male same-sex sexual activity. And there he footnotes Bernadette Bruton's book, Love Between Women. Both special examples of human waywardness. So here he's kind of trying to briefly summarize the non-affirming reading of Romans 1, if you want to call it that. So he continues this brief summation of the non-affirming argument. Female same-sex behavior is thought to be the subject of verse 26, and male same-sex sexual activity that of verse 27. The behaviors mentioned in both verses are understood in Romans 1 as he says, ultimate reasons for bringing judgment upon humanity, in a passage reflecting a missional endeavor that encompasses the entire human race that refuses to acknowledge God's preeminence. There he's quoting Jewett, but it's interesting that he's using Robert Jewett, who wrote a Romans commentary that is itself affirming, I believe, takes an affirming stance of Romans 1. I haven't done a video on Jewett's commentary yet. That's planned in the future. But it's interesting is using Jewett to summarize the non-affirming reading of Romans 1. Homoeroticism is singled out, along with, even connected to, idolatry as reasons for divine wrath to fall on all humanity. Okay. As Caseman observed, one-sidedly emphasizing sex, he speaks of women and men with scorn. Okay, this is, again, he's using Caseman and I think Jewett, both of whom I think are, don't quote me, but I think Caseman also has somewhat of an affirming reading. But I want to look at that as well, because Caseman keeps being referenced in all of these works, whether article or books, that take an affirming stance. Okay. Let's see. And yet, this section of the epistle, 118 to 320, deals with the totality of the cosmos and not just with an aggregate of individuals. Hence, it deals with humanity as such and not just with representatives of religious groupings. Okay, just referencing, quoting Caseman and Jewett here in that paragraph. Then he goes on. Then he argues, however, female homoeroticism is not stated in verse 26. The verse only states that females participated in unnatural sexual activity. Okay. Writes Jamie Bannister, who takes an affirming perspective as well in her article. Her article is, let's see, I'll see it when it gets quoted in the next page. Jamie Bannister says, Romans 1:26 has received much attention because it is possibly the only clear reference to and condemnation of female homoerotic activity in the biblical texts. However, female homoerotic activity is not explicitly mentioned in the passage. Rather, the specific interpretation rests solely on the content of the subsequent verse 27, in which Paul describes male homoerotic activity in the context of condemning it. And Bannister's article is titled Homoios and the Use of Parallelism in Romans 1:26-27, which was published in 2009 in the Journal of Biblical Literature. Okay, I should look at that one as well. All right, so a new subsection here, the grammatical use of homoios, which is, for whatever reason, he hones in on that and makes the argument that this is like the main argument that non-affirming readers, interpreters use to say that female homoeroticism is mentioned in verse 26. Okay. But my main reaction to that brief summation of the non-affirming argument is that it didn't represent the non-affirming argument well at all. It's kind of a straw man. So I know space is limited in journal articles, and you got to be quick. But I'm kind of disappointed in that representation. Typically, in a paper or in a debate, you want to represent the other side the way that they would want to be represented, and it doesn't feel that way. Okay, next subsection, which is titled "The Grammatical Use of Homoios." This problem, namely the lack of any mention of female homoeroticism in verse 26, is usually met with the evocation of homoios in verse 27. Okay, and there he quotes those two verses again. Homoios is that word that's often translated as likewise or in the same way. Okay, at the beginning of verse 27. Under this interpretive strategy, again, interesting terminology, it is understood that the term homoios allows the interpreter to read back into verse 26 what is so clearly noted in verse 27, namely male homoeroticism. It is assumed then that since females are the subject of verse 26, that female homoeroticism is the issue of verse 26. James Miller has opposed finding verse 26 referring to female homoeroticism himself, and that is, let's see, an article already mentioned previously. Homoios might simply mean that both the women and the men under consideration were sexually deviant, but in differing ways. Bernadette Bruton, he keeps referencing Bruton as like his main non-affirming author. Bernadette Bruton has countered Miller's position, stating, I argue that unnatural intercourse refers specifically to, turn the page, specifically to sexual relations between women because, one, the likewise, homoios, of Romans 1:27 serves to specify the meaning of Romans 1:26, and two, other ancient sources depict sexual relations between women as unnatural. Plato, Seneca, the Elder, Martial, Ovid, Ptolemy, Artemidorus, probably Dorotheus of Sidon, all right, end quote of Bruton. Point number two, however, Provance argues, assumes the conclusion in a premise, and thus it would appear that this one word, homoios, is the primary evidence, there we go, the primary evidence given by Bruton that substantiates her view on the nature of the activity in verse 26. And there, footnote 13, he quotes that again, or in footnote 14 is what I'm wanting. On this point, she is not alone, he says, and ends that paragraph. And the footnote 14 says, and so it says, though my position on Romans 1:26-27 differs from Bruton, her significant work on this passage is invaluable to the point that any study of this passage must consult her work. And he also states somewhere, I haven't come across it yet, that many other non-affirming interpreters kind of make the same argument as Bruton. Next paragraph, Jamie Bannister's article has notably challenged a hermeneutical strategy of reading back verse 27 into verse 26 via the term homoios, addressing every New Testament passage involving homoios and also noting various uses of homoios in the Septuagint, Philo, Josephus, and the Apostolic Fathers. She has demonstrated that this reading back approach is never demanded by the New Testament text, never is italicized, and at times would be detrimental to proper interpretation. Okay? While in a number of cases the antecedent clause dictated the meaning of the subsequent homoios clause, the reverse was not the case. Quote, the result is that of the 28 eligible New Testament passages for consideration, in 25, 89%, it would be impossible or illogical to use the homoios clause to interpret its antecedent clause. Okay? End quote. Of the three passages remaining for consideration, which is Luke 17:28, John 6:11, and Jude 8, Bannister finds no instance in which each case of the homoios clause determining meaning in the antecedent clauses. Okay, so that's Bannister's argument. Thus it stands, Provance continues, that the modern interpretive assumption, okay, so this terminology, I think we just need to point out, this terminology is trying to take away perhaps the church history argument that this is how Christians have understood this passage and understood same-sex sex as sinful, not only since the time of Jesus and the beginning of the church, but also since the time of Moses, maybe. But specifically, I think this terminology is trying to take away the church history argument from at least Christian church history of the past 2,000 years by calling it modern. That's just something that comes to my mind as I read this. He goes on, thus it stands that the modern interpretive assumption in finding female homoeroticism in verse 26 is simply not a rhetorical, grammatical approach utilized by the ancient authors. Okay, there you go. He's trying to take away the ancient, let's say, enchanted understanding of Romans 1 and the ancient enchanted understanding that same-sex sexual activity is a sin in light of the Genesis 6 and 19 stories and not the other way around, right? It is a weak inference, he says, weak inference and warrant in interpreting Romans 1:26 to 27, the homoios argument. Indeed, it is virtually unwarranted. Man, strong language here. Thus, the unnatural sexual action of the women remains unidentified. Okay. All right. However, there is a well-known legend in ancient Jewish literary history that involves unnatural sexual activity on the part of certain women. Indeed, two of Bannister's three remaining passages concern interests of this paper, namely passages involving the Watchers, Flood, and Sodom judgments. The place of homoios will be reconsidered later in the paper. Okay. End of that subsection, beginning of a new subsection, where he's already kind of said, hey, verse 26 doesn't refer to female homoeroticism. Now he's going to make a quick argument that, hey, male homoeroticism isn't actually mentioned in verse 27 either. Okay, so beginning of the subsection, male homoerotic activity singled out in verse 27. Here we go. Beyond the initial hermeneutical difficulty of finding female homoeroticism in verse 26 is why male same-sex sexual activity should be so singled out for judgment in verse 27 and in such language. Here he quotes Jewett once again. Here we have the most egregious instance of Paul can find to demonstrate his thesis about human distortion, the arena of sexual perversity that created wide revulsion in the Jewish and early Christian communities of his time. The depiction of a particularly unpopular example for the sake of an effective argument leads Paul to highly prejudicial language, particularly to the modern ear. Okay, but my summation of perhaps the previous section, sorry for starting this second subsection without my summation, but there's got to be, I think there is also more evidence in the text for arguing that female homoeroticism, female same-sex sex is actually mentioned by Paul in verse 26 and simply Provance saying, hey, this is the best argument, the homoios argument. In my mind, I believe it is. That's my initial kind of in the moment thought, right? The blink, kind of like in terms of that one author. I forget his name right now. The guy who wrote Blink, Malcolm Gladwell. But why doesn't he handle it all and consider all the arguments? Obviously, time doesn't permit him. So in his mind, he thinks homoios is that main argument. But it's not the only one. It's not, and those two he mentioned by Bruton aren't the only ones either. So again, I'm just kind of like a little disappointed that he's summarizing the non-affirming reading and interpretation. So not, I think in my thinking, well enough. Okay, but let's go back to the next subsection. He says, yet Hayes, referring to Richard Hayes, referencing Furnish, Casement, and Cranfield, that Hayes, quoting Hayes, Romans 1 is neither a general discussion of sexual ethics nor an explicitly prescriptive admonition about the sexual behavior appropriate for Christians. This is quoting Richard Hayes's article back in the 80s, I believe, where Hayes took a non-affirming position on Romans 1. Indeed, he asks, why does Paul introduce the reference to homosexual behavior in Romans 1, 26 through 27? If he is not giving moral instruction to his readers, why does the topic arise at all? All right. Indeed, and Hayes offers his interpretation, the exchange of truth for a lie to which Paul refers in Romans 1, 18 to 25 is a mytho-historical event in which the whole pagan world is implicated. Again, quoting Hayes. And yet Hayes identifies he says, no particular, they're italicized by the author, no particular mytho-historical event, no particular occurrence. He continues, quoting Hayes, in the same way, the charge that these fallen humans have exchanged natural relations for unnatural means nothing more nor less than that human beings created for heterosexual companionship, as the Genesis story bears witness, have distorted even so basic a truth as their sexual identity by rejecting the male and female roles which are naturally theirs in God's created order. End of quote. Provance continues, and yet this is not the experience of most humans. How does a minority account for a universal charge? How does a minority account for a universal charge? Okay. There is something askew in modern interpretations. They're again using modern again. And you know what? He's not entirely wrong, right? I think perhaps a lot of, we would say, modern non-affirming readings and takes aren't considering reading the Genesis 6 and Genesis 19 stories the way that ancient Jews and Christians did, understanding in terms of the Watchers and the way First Enoch unpacks the Genesis 6 story, the flood story, and therefore how we should also read Genesis 19 as a result as well. Okay, so he's got a point here. There is something askew in modern interpretations of Paul's message. Rather, a particular mytho-historical event must be identified. He italicizes identified. And there is a mytho-historical event that involves judgment of the whole world and will soon be covered in this paper. End of that subsection. Okay, and so he's got like one or two more subsections here before he ends, about one more page before he ends the first section of the paper where he argues against the non-affirming reading of Romans 1. So here we go. The beginning of the next subsection, which is titled The Shift to Past Tense, Looking to Past Events. All right. So the shift from the present to the aorist that Romans 1:21 takes the audience into the past. The shift from present tense verbs in verse 18 to 20 to aorist verbs in verse 21 to 23 signals a turn to the representatives of an archaic past who turned away from the truth and imposed a grim future on their descendants. There he's quoting Jewett once again. Indeed, a stated third person, they and them, become the subjects in verses 19 to 28. All right. Let's see. This shift in tense and referencing what appears to be a specific group is critical to understanding the overall passage. It will be shown that the past tense takes the audience to ancient times, to the stories of old. So that's the end of that brief subsection as well. And the final subsection of the first part of his article is the apocalyptic background of the general context Romans 1:18 to 32. Here we go. We're going to finish real quick. We're just going to be a little bit over 30 minutes here. As this paper seeks to offer a better general explanation of Romans 1:26 to 27 than the status quo, the general setting of the text should be noted. Romans 1:26 to 27 is part of a well-defined passage influenced by apocalyptic rhetoric, beginning with a double revelation. And there he quotes verses 16 and 17 and 18 of Romans 1, where the Greek term revelation is found. Apocalypte. I can't read that. My Greek is bad. But the Greek term apocalypse, or revelation, to reveal, that is mentioned several times in verses 16 through 18 in Romans 1. Concerning 1:17, next paragraph, Caseman writes, even if apocalyptein, I think I got it right there, does not necessarily have an apocalyptic sense in this context that seems most natural. Indeed, quoting Caseman again, the antithesis between the righteousness which reveals itself in the gospel and the wrath which discloses itself ap uranu in the stereotype phraseology of Judaism and primitive Christianity show that the apocalyptic view is also held by Paul. Again, referencing footnotes Caseman there. However, apocalyptic in Romans 1:18 to 32 is carefully utilized, as in all Romans 1:18 to 32, there is no mention of quote-unquote sin, law, or Gentiles. It is not an us versus them statement. It is a statement about humanity, and from verse 21 on, a statement about humanity's past. It is a rather grand statement regarding human depravity and God's action against such. Okay? Final paragraph. But Paul's apocalyptic indictment is multifaceted. Paul is not only critical of sexual deviance in Romans 1:18 to 32, he also finds fault in humanity for deterioration of cognition and for idol worship, shunning knowledge of God manifested via creation, all of which are connected with sexual deviance. And there he specifically references Wisdom 14:12, which states, for the idea of making idols was the beginning of fornication, and the invention of them was the corruption of life. Okay, which is a very interesting section in Wisdom of Solomon, a very interesting verse as well. The cognitive decline, Provance continues, in Romans 1 is stated as an indictment, in that God is revealed as made manifest through a consideration of the creation. These associated areas of human depravity are important for locating Romans 1:26 to 27 within its rhetorical tradition, which will be discussed below now. End of section 1. Okay, so I've made my comments throughout reading this section. I think he's right in a way of saying, hey, I think a lot of modern interpretations are missing something. I think we can always say that, but yeah, I think he's particularly right and said modern takes on Romans 1 aren't truly taking into consideration a lot of significant pieces of literature or events in the past, like the Watcher's story, like First Enoch, like Genesis 19. Okay, I'll give him that, and I love it. I love this paper because he points a lot of things out that many people aren't looking at. All right, so I really, really like this paper in that way. But I think his ultimate conclusion, I think, is off base. Obviously, an affirming take on Romans 1, trying to argue that Paul isn't really talking about homosexuality at all in Romans 1. But my main response so far, right now, as I end this particular video, is this. Again, why not both? Why can't you have Paul specifically referring back to that theme of the Watcher's story, the flood story, and the Sodom theme of combining those two stories together as examples of judgment and bad behavior from Genesis all the way through intertestamental literature to the first century where Paul writes Romans 1. Why can't you have Paul doing that, referencing them specifically and intentionally referencing those two stories, as well as also speaking against same-sex sexual activity? I think you can. And I think you can by taking into consideration what Dr. Michael Heiser said again in his book, The Unseen Realm, that Romans 1:18 and following is like the best place in the New Testament to see the Deuteronomy 32 worldview at play. And again, if you want to hear my take on that, go back to the first like 7 videos on this channel so you can watch me, listen to me read through that initial paper that I wrote back in 2020. Okay, so next video we'll cover the second section, the second main part of his article where he makes his argument, and we'll respond to that as well. Until then, thanks for watching. We'll see you later. Goodbye.